This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Natalie Avalos. Natalie Avalos is an assistant professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is an ethnographer of religion whose teaching and research examine Indigenous religious life, land-based ethics, healing historical trauma, and decolonization. She received her Ph.D. in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara with a special focus on Native American and Indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism, and is currently working on her manuscript titled Decolonizing Metaphysics, Transnational Indigeneities, and Religious Refusal, which explores urban Indigenous and Tibetan refugee religious life as decolonial praxis. We discuss these topics as well as her article, Decolonizing Approaches to Indigenous Plant Medicines, Recognizing Plant Sovereignty. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Natalie Avalos. Dr. Natalie Avalos, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so delighted that you're here, and I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am currently an assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department. I actually teach Native and Indigenous studies there, but my PhD is in religious studies, and my two subfields are Native American and Indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism. So I am affiliated faculty with religious studies also at CU Boulder, but am in ethnic studies.
Nice. I'm curious on every guest's backstory a little bit. I'm wondering how you got interested in your academic fields of Indigenous religious life, land-based ethics, historical trauma, decolonization. Is there an interesting backstory or like stepping stones along the way to finding those particular areas of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be interesting in the sense that it was this very organic process for me. I think I've often described it as my own decolonial journey or coming to understand myself as a colonial subject living in the US, having two parents with Mexican and Native ancestry from Mexico, and trying to understand, well, why is it that we didn't grow up with our Indigenous traditions? Why was it that, my dad was a minister, and so I grew up in a very, what I would describe a colonized context as I began to understand that, Christianity, conversion, missionization was a major part of the colonial project. And this is why we didn't necessarily have access to living Indigenous traditions, even though they both have Native ancestry. So I was trying to understand that history and also really trying to reconnect with, well, what was it that my Indigenous ancestors believed? What was it that my grandparents and their parents may have done in the world that was distinct and different that I would just not otherwise ever know if I didn't dig deeper. And of course, as I was starting that journey, because I grew up in the Bay Area and was really plugged into activist circles, like kind of women of color radical circles, but also like radical politics within the Bay Area punk scene. And it was It was a great fertile place for, transgressive ideas. I think I started to get burnt out on the activist scene a little and plugged into Buddhist community, and I started studying Buddhism in my 20s, and I think that kind of led me to want to do both, try and understand native philosophy and religious life, but also the power and real beauty of Buddhism as a tradition. Yeah.
Mm. Well, I'm going to fight my powerful urge right now to ask you about all the shows you've ever been to at Gilman Street,
Which were
because
amazing. And I started going to Gilman when I was like 15.
what year did you first go to Gilman?
I was 15 in 1992.
Oh man, there are
Yeah.
some like legendary like Propagandy and Rancid shows there and
Yeah.
Jawbreaker and stuff that happened all during those years. Those are all my favorite bands ever. And the Bay Area punk scene, documented in the amazing film Turn It Around, the story of Bay Area punk.
Yeah.
I
I knew the
absolutely
guys
love it.
that created that doc, actually. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that may be that's the
That's another
biggest
podcast.
that's the biggest tangent that I'm ever going to avoid going down on this podcast right now because you just touched me right in my major interest area of music besides this. Anyway,
Yeah.
so let's chat about how you got interested in Tibetan Buddhism as well. Bring that into the story a little bit as well.
Yeah. So when I was a teenager, part of, I think, my teenage rebellion, growing up in such a strict Christian Pentecostal and then later evangelical home, was to look at and study other religious traditions. And I was really interested in Taoism and Buddhism. And it started to really speak to me, especially in my 20s, because I think I was trying to not only was I plugged into like these feminists and transgressive like activist circles, but I was really interested in, how is it that people are healing from cycles of violence? I grew up in an environment where there was just a lot of interpersonal violence, not just in my home, but in my community.
Mhm.
There was lots of just poverty and chaos. And so I was trying to understand, well, how do people empower themselves and heal themselves and restore a sense of personal dignity to themselves after dealing with layers of racialization, dispossession, poverty. And that's really, I think, where Tibetan Buddhism came in for me. And it was really, uh, I could describe it as like a balm for my heart. And it
Mm.
really helped me see that not only was I not alone in my own suffering, but that, suffering was a common and everyday experience for all of us, but it just in very different ways. And it helped me develop compassion for other people, but importantly for myself, because I think what can happen when you're a kid in like transgressive spaces is you can end up very, very cynical. And I
Mm.
think I had been stuck there for many years. And so Tibetan Buddhism was a place that brought me back to this sense of personal power and agency that it helped me transform my victim story to one of like survival and the possibilities of transforming your suffering into something beautiful. How do you alchemize that? And so I
Yeah.
was really also when I started studying Tibetan Buddhism, I was really touched to learn more about the story of Tibetans and how they were colonized. And of course, as someone with Native ancestry, I was like, this looks very parallel. And it doesn't seem like folks are talking about the colonization that Tibetans are experiencing. And so I was interested in linking those stories as a grad student, of how do we make their dispossession and suffering much more visible? Because I just didn't feel like Buddhist study scholars were talking about it enough.
Mm. Wonderful. Well, the discussion about cynicism just now is actually something that I've been dealing with in my own life kind of recently. So you just kind of touched on something that I have personally been trying to work through in some of the aspects of my own life. So thank you for that. It gives me a little something to remember as I move into the rest of my day today. So you have a book in the works called Decolonizing Metaphysics, Transnational Indigeneities, and Religious Refusal. How is that process going? Maybe give us a little preview of what listeners can expect from that manuscript that's in development.
Yeah, so this book, um, I was interested in putting these stories in conversation, partly to help not only myself, but also other scholars in religious studies, Native and Indigenous studies, and even settler colonial studies understand, well, what is the nature of settler colonialism? We understand it as a political, economic strategy, form of dispossession that operates long term. It argues that settler colonialism is not just one event. It's not something that happened in 1492. It's not something that happened maybe in the 1500s, but it's ongoing. Just in basically helping you visualize how Native people in the US and in Latin America are still colonized, and how Tibetan people are experiencing these really parallel forms. And so I wanted to look at, well, what are some of the similarities here, but also what is it that people are doing on the ground? How is it that they're using their religious life to empower themselves, to heal themselves as a buffer against that kind of cynicism, alienation, shame, profound suffering that I think colonialism and racialization can produce in people. And so, um, this was an ethnographic project. I spent several years in New Mexico working with the Tibetan community in Santa Fe and with urban Indian folks, urban Indigenous folks in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. And I wanted to be there because my dad's family is from New Mexico, and I really just fell in love with the place. And what I found was that people were using their religious life to really restore their sense of community and identity. For Tibetans, especially living as refugees, they had to maintain a sense of who they are, their culture, but also their sense of peoplehood or togetherness. And peoplehood is often theorized in Native and Indigenous studies as this is an Indigenous form of nationhood.
Hmm.
Nationhood in a Westphalian Western sense is quite distinct. That, it's more of a political economic project, whereas peoplehood is about having a shared sense of identity, worldview, language, long historical tradition of creation narratives, relationships to place, right?
Yeah.
And that's what coheres you as a people, and that's what forms your sense of nationhood, but also that's really the driving force of your sovereignty. And so I was really curious to talk to people and understand, well, how is it that they are still asserting this sense of autonomy, even in a transnational context? And I think this was true for urban, Native, and Indigenous folks too, because I think in the US, we have a tendency to believe, well, if Native people aren't living in reservation contexts or they're not living with their home communities, they must be totally assimilated. And the opposite is true. You have huge numbers of Native people. Now, two-thirds of Native people are living in cities, but you have really thriving Native and Indigenous communities in cities that are actively developing religious life, whether it's like backyard sweat lodges or
Hmm.
powwows. And there are so many different iterations of this, whether it's indigenous practices like curanderismo that are coming from south of the US-Mexico border, their own forms of sweat lodges, etc. And I noticed that in places in Albuquerque and Santa Fe and even beyond, there was a lot of conversation between the two, that there was this hemispheric sense of identity that kind of um, transgressed or transcended the border, that US-Mexico border, in really unique and profound ways. And so I wanted to tell that story that, people were still asserting their peoplehood. People are still actively invested in remaining who they are and refusing forms of ethnic cleansing, refusing forms of assimilation. And ultimately, as they do that and restore their sense of relationality, restore their sense of care for land and their embeddedness in lands and really the deep recognition that there is spiritual power immanent in lands and that it's always acting for and with you if you are propitiating it, caring for it, respecting it, and that this happens in both Tibetan and Native communities, even transnationally. And so I really see that as an expression of sovereignty, really a kind of metaphysical sovereignty, but a sovereignty that is just not as visible to us in the West because we think of sovereignty. Well, the irony is that in the West, sovereignty was initially theorized as divine right through Christian power, right?
Hmm.
That was mediated through kings. Whereas I think in this other indigenous relational context, sovereignty is about having a covenant with lands
Yeah.
and the power that exists in lands, and that form of sovereignty, I think, is not only not primitive, it's deeply rational. Especially if we want to um, consider the agency of lands and fight environmental destruction. So that's a little bit of what it's about.
Yeah, well, and your focus on land is really interesting to me as well. And you sent me another article called Indigenous Stewardship and the Death Rattle of White Supremacy from the journal Political Theology. And it has references to the Idle No More movement. It has references to the Standing Rock movement, to Wounded Knee. So there's a lot of land, like historical examples that are referred to in this piece. Can you just tell me a little bit about what this article is about? Because I think that listeners who like what you're saying about land would enjoy this article too.
Yeah, so I actually wrote this because I had started to develop curriculum around 2016 and 2017 for students. I was teaching at Connecticut College on the East Coast, and Standing Rock was percolating as a movement. And what happened there was that a group of Native folks at the Standing Rock Reservation, it's a Lakota Dakota reservation, between the Dakotas. They were fighting a pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that was um, supposed to be built right under and crossing the Missouri and Cannonball rivers. And right at that intersection, it's considered not only lands that were essentially protected through prior treaties, but it's considered sacred land that was frequented by Cheyenne peoples, by other Dakota peoples. And it was a place where people understood as neutral territory because people would go there to pray. They would go there to have ceremony. And um, there was a camp set up called the Sacred Stone Camp that was developed to essentially provide a headquarters during this standoff. And it was a headquarters dedicated to ceremony and prayer by Standing Rock folks and other Native people. What was interesting is that even though it was initiated by a small group of people, within months, thousands of other Native people started to join this fight at Standing Rock because Native people across the US, Canada, really in other parts of the world are confronting these issues, whether it's mining, oil extraction, pipelines being built. They are fighting these really intense fights where they're having confrontations not just with city and county police, but with private security forces that are quite powerful. They're fighting companies that have millions backing them. They have lawyers that are the best lawyers in the country backing them. And basically, states and federal governments are greenlighting and backing them. And so it's a real David and Goliath story here.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to talk about how these folks, they kept essentially arguing on the ground, well, we're not protesters, we're protectors. We're
Mm-hmm.
stewards of land. Our job by covenant, right? Because every native nation has their own covenant with particular places, meaning they have an agreement that that particular place provides them with their material needs, but also existential and spiritual needs, right? It protects them, it guides them, they interact and talk and communicate during ceremonial times. And that in return, human persons protect the other than human persons that are there, meaning plants, animals, waters, mountains. They're understood to have personhood too. They're understood to have a shared consciousness. And so there's this intersubjective relationship there. And again, that's where the covenant of sovereignty really lies, is through this relationship, this agreed upon relationship between the two. And so for these native folks, eventually there was indigenous peoples coming from not only First Nations in Canada, but you had Yaqui and Maya people coming, you had people coming from Maori people coming from New Zealand, you had Sami peoples coming from Northern Europe. You had a whole international indigenous community forming because they understood the dire need to protect these lands. And really, as many of them were saying, we're not protecting them for our own selfish purposes. We're protecting them for everyone's benefit because
Yeah.
we all rely on this water. And if we contaminate the waters, we're hurting ourselves, right? And so I think it was very important to share and highlight that these folks were really doing ethical work on all of our behalf. And it was a major sacrifice. And they were beaten and tased and thrown in dog kennels. I mean, they were abused so badly by the police and private security forces, but ultimately their aim was just to protect us. And
Mm.
I think that's why it was important to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned something a few minutes ago as well, and you mentioned plants, and I feel like that's a perfect segue into another major area of your research. You sent me another article that I really loved called Decolonizing Approaches to Indigenous Plant Medicines, Recognizing Plant Sovereignty. And I've talked about this issue a couple of times. Like had a guest on to talk about his experiences with ayahuasca ceremonies, and I had another conversation with Dr. Dennis Kelly from the University of Missouri who was talking a little bit about this. But I am really intrigued to hear more from you on this topic. So I'm wondering if you can give listeners a basic overview of the purpose of indigenous plant medicines for what you think everybody should know who's like a total beginner of this topic.
This is so complicated because there has been incredible research really in the last couple of decades. It was happening kind of underground and it's become more um, known and I think above board in the last decade or so. And the research is on psychedelics and entheogens, basically things like psilocybin, um, even things like LSD and MDMA. But psilocybin specifically was a really popular one. And psilocybin is essentially a compound extracted from what people would call medicinal mushrooms. And these medicinal mushrooms have been found in various parts of the world, but in the West, I think they really were kind of quote unquote discovered through a group of Mazatec people in Mexico that were using them ceremonially. And so we know that they have been used ceremonially for thousands of years among indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica and beyond. And so this medicine is so profound because it's one of the few things that can actually heal and treat PTSD. Western medicine has not really been able to come up with a cure for PTSD. There's no method or treatment that has been effective. And these medicines are basically the only thing that have not only helped people with PTSD, but treatment-resistant depression, people that have had complex PTSD too, like developmental trauma. So it's really huge. It's helping veterans, it's helping folks that have experienced years and years of abuse. And this research, now that it's exploding and the possibilities of using it in therapeutic contexts is becoming more real, partly because people are seeing how effective it is. With that comes a lot of concern from Indigenous communities around, well, if these medicines, whether it's ayahuasca, psilocybin, maybe even peyote, and peyote is protected, it's in a protected class, that means that only Native peoples that are part of the Native American Church can use it. And that's a whole long, complicated story. Dennis Kelly may have talked a little
Huge
bit about
history.
that. Yeah. And but the concern is that if we begin to commodify these medicines, that big pharma takes over, and we know big pharma, they're not nice guys, right? And that not only indigenous peoples might lose access, but any person who is socially marginalized might lose access, much in the same way that medical marijuana became a huge industry that didn't necessarily help, even though it was initially touted as there to help for therapeutic and medical use, right? Now those folks are struggling with access. So the fear is not only for indigenous peoples losing access, but also that these medicines are being decontextualized from their ceremonial context and the potential harm that that might bring. Yeah.
Gotcha. And something stands out as well about the term plant persons, and you have the word sovereignty is in the title.
Yeah.
So I feel like these two things are connected, right? Tell me a little bit more about plant medicines as plant persons.
So in this context, like I mentioned with Standing Rock, indigenous peoples understand that these medicines actually have a form of consciousness that is more intelligent than human persons. And so these beings are revered. They're understood to be sacred. You have to respect them and go into any ceremonial context with them with a very clear intention. And traditionally, people use these medicines to help heal themselves of psychological trauma harm, physical trauma harm, but also ultimately, one of the outcomes is that they have a profound experience where they see themselves as deeply connected to all other natural phenomena. They see in some ways we could call it like the metaphysical truth, right? Of
Hmm.
their experience is not separate from the world, but actually deeply embedded and as having a shared consciousness with the plants and animals, waters, etc. And so I think that's where the framework that all these other persons, they may not be human persons, but they have personhood, right? And so I think that framework may have even come out of the use of these plant medicines and other forms of um, prayer, meditation, fasting, etc., like altered states. Because when you have that recognition that these other plant persons are not only wise and that they're not only there to protect you and help you and maybe even lead humans and give humans advice on how to live, but you internalize this ethic that actually you as a human person, your whole job as an individual, but then as a collective with your native community, your whole job is actually just to care for the land and treat it with um, enough tenderness, tend to it in ways that it enables your life, but all life to continue, right? Meaning that all the life around you is dependent on you to cultivate it and to protect it. And so I think that's where the plant personhood is really important. And also the issue around sovereignty. Again, sovereignty is relational here. It's
Yeah.
about having this deep sense of respect and commitment to care for lands. And so a lot of times Native people say, well, it's not that we somehow are innately sovereign. Lands themselves are sovereign. These plants themselves have agency. They have intelligence. We're learning from them. They are our teachers. And so we have to respect their leadership. And ultimately, we're here to serve them because they've been asking us to just try and protect all of the persons around us, right? And that's been working for us, for thousands and thousands of years. And we want to keep that cycle going. And so one of the concerns, again, is that when these medicines are decontextualized from that context and they're put into a different teleological trajectory of like, personal wellness, which is great. Personal wellness is important. But will we lose sight of the collective wellness? Because our collective wellness is dependent on the well-being of lands as well, right? We can't separate the two. And I think that's a piece that can't get lost. And I was really, as I started to learn about the growing and booming industry of, psychotherapists getting trained to use entheogens, which again, very important work. I think it's necessary work, but are we listening to Indigenous people? Are we following their leadership? Are we recognizing that there are greater goals beyond just our individual health and wellness here? And I think that's really important to understand. And so that's why I started doing this work because this boom is happening quickly.
Yeah.
And I felt like, okay, we need to get some information out there for people to think about this now before it's a runaway train. Yeah.
Well, and it kind of reminds me too, just a teeny tiny little bit of the decontextualization of the concept of mindfulness and how that was like brought into like corporate America trainings and things like that. And all
Totally.
of a sudden you're talking about this thousands of year old concept and you're doing it in like Apple headquarters where everybody's like, dressed up for their corporate jobs every single day with that decontextualized like removal of the history of it all.
That's right.
And it just kind of reminds me of that, only this time it's talking about, you know, plant substances that are mind altering. And so there's a lot of history here and complexity that goes into a topic like this.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think there's very real parallels, right? Like, how is it that we have, through settler colonialism, been socialized and directed towards the purposes of capitalism versus the purposes of collective care and well-being and mutuality? And I think that's really at the center of the story as well.
Yeah. Well, let's chat a little bit about you and your bringing your work into like a public facing way, right? You're doing work that's really interesting. You're writing about topics like plant medicines that are, like, as you said, booming in popularity in multiple ways, for better and for worse. And you're doing these like public scholarship trainings with sacred rights. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about why you think it matters for scholars to get their work kind of more out into the public sphere and be engaged in those conversations yourself.
I think as someone that went into academia because I was so on fire to help share ideas with young people. Again, because as a young person, I was cynical and searching for answers. And you know, I think in some ways I'm trying to be the educator that I needed as a young
Hmm.
person. And so I really, really want to empower young people, but also my colleagues and all of us to better understand power, to better understand racialization, how it still operates, right? How we become coerced into uh, living a commodity oriented life versus like a purpose oriented life. And so to me, public facing work takes ideas that often just are operating within the academy in a very specialized spaces and brings them out to everyday folks, right? Folks that might not have access to a college course, folks that maybe are just scrolling through Twitter, right? Even friends and family that are connected via Facebook. And so I feel like it's really important for us to bring our ideas that are actively, engaged in academic argumentation and thought, and just make them visible and legible for folks that want to know, that are curious, but just don't have access. And so public facing work, I think, can be really powerful. And I feel actually really invested in trying to get as much public facing work out as possible for that reason. And I don't know, actually didn't mention this, but I had a short piece come out in Maximum Rock and Roll about decolonizing the classroom. And that was probably like
Yes.
6 years ago. But yeah, spaces like that, it's important,
Yeah.
and um so I've had a great experience with sacred rites. One of the things that I really, really like is that they're forcing us to think through, okay, well, what are the big rewards here? What are the things that you can get out of this? But what are your responsibilities? What are the things that drive you? What are the real risks? And for me, I think my concern was, okay, as a woman of color scholar who's also light skinned and has light skin privilege, I may get some flack, but I'm probably not going to get the same level of like racist hate mail as some of my colleagues. Like I have some colleagues in my department, they write some really profound, high profile op-eds, and we have been BCC'd on their hate mail. It's pretty insane stuff. But I haven't really received any pushback or flack. And I realized that in some ways, maybe I could keep pushing those boundaries. We'll see what happens. But that those risks are not enough to prevent me from continuing to speak up and out. And I feel a deep, deep commitment because of my Native ancestry to advocate for Indigenous people's issues. I just feel like they are among the most silenced and invisibilized in the US. And we don't hear enough about the fights that they're facing, about the kinds of violence that they still live day to day, but also about the incredible strides and work they do on the ground. And so I'm deeply committed to talking about that and sharing that in a public way. And I think working with the cohort that I have this summer has helped energize that part of me for sure.
Amazing. Well, I love that I get to add you to my little sub plot of this show of involving punk and musicians and things like that on the show. I've had Jimmy from the band Judge. I had Ray Capo from Shelter and Youth of Today. Greg Deal from the band Dead Pioneers and Chris from Propagandy have all been on this podcast talking about spirituality and uh, religion in general. So it's cool that I get to slide you into that little like that little subplot I've got going on. What projects are you working on for public stuff that you're kind of excited about? Do you want to talk about anything or preview anything?
Right now, I'm trying to get out some public facing work on plant medicines, partly because I live in Denver and here in Colorado, um, there are a few plant medicines like psilocybin that have been decriminalized. And I know that there are other states that are working on it. And while on the one hand, there are folks that are like, this is really good, this is great. On the other, there are local indigenous groups and kind of BIPOC psychedelic groups that I've already started to work with on the ground that are going, hey, we really have to slow down and rethink how we're navigating this because, again, look, we're living in the US. These things become commodified and packaged and may become part of a greater medical industrial complex that prevents even indigenous leaders from having access to some of these medicines. And, what is the possibility that they become over harvested? And then even in the case of some of the Mazatec peoples that first exposed Westerners to psilocybin, they had the experience where some of these medicines actually stopped working almost in protest. And I think that it helps us understand that these medicines are not inert material objects. They cannot just be packaged. They have to be treated with care and respect. And I think it really will force us to rethink what medicine is in this country, how we commodify it and treat it like an industry when really it's about relationships. And we can't ignore that. And so I'm hoping to get a piece out later this year that talks about that. And yeah, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Natalie Avalos, is there anywhere that you would direct people's attention if they want to know more about what you do and follow along with your work?
Yeah, so I have a personal website, a WordPress site that's basically just like nataliemayavalos.com, which is like my WordPress. I'll send you the link because I may have actually even said that wrong. We'll see. But my faculty page is probably the other second best place to find my work because I have links to a lot of public facing pieces as well as articles. So that is on the CU Boulder Ethnic Studies faculty page.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Natalie Avalos, thank you so much for being on Classical Ideas and chatting with me about your variety of areas of interest, a few different pieces of your work, and also your goals for the future with regards to getting your work out there for a wider audience. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to chat. And yeah, thank you for doing this work.